Hey, this video is on applying the 80-20 principle to life and ultimately happiness. And I think that's pretty interesting. So if you're not familiar with the 80-20 principle, I'll explain it here. If you are, you can skip ahead a couple minutes and I'll start talking about a few exercises you can do. But the 80-20 principle was discovered by, I believe he was an economist. His last name was Pareto, so you'll sometimes hear it referred to as the Pareto principle. And it's really fascinating. So he was studying pea plants, and he was into like genetics and trying to understand some of how they worked and how they transmitted their genes and whatever. And he noticed something kind of weird. He noticed that it was something like in a garden of 10 plants, there would be 2 of the plants that just went crazy and produced almost all the seeds for the future plants, and then the rest just didn't do all that much. And he started to model this out, and he did all the mathematics behind it, and he noticed this pattern that was about 20% of the plants led to 80% of the seeds. And he started to look for this similar pattern in other places. Now, important common misunderstanding is that it doesn't have to be exactly 80-20, nor does it have to add up to 100. They just do that because it's kind of a good way to remember it. But think about it like this. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but we know that probably about 1% of the world's population owns about 95% of the wealth. We know that the top 5% percent or so of cities account for 95 to probably 99% of the global population. We see this pattern in all sorts of different areas. If you look at like engineering even, oftentimes it'll be 20% of the processes lead to 80% of the errors. You look at business and you probably say that 20% of your company's products or services lead to 80% of the revenue, or 20% of the customers lead to 80% of the revenue. Or if you just are dealing with life, it's like in your life, there's probably, I don't know, a small handful of people, maybe 10% of people in your life that account for 90% of your problems and frustrations. Isn't that true? So the bottom line is we see this pattern everywhere, and there's a ton of like strategy applications if you're thinking about business, if you're thinking about productivity. And that can be true, again, whether you are kind of a business owner, that type of person, entrepreneur, or even if you just have a normal job doing whatever it is you're doing, there's many, many applications of this principle. And the fundamental idea then is that you can get more from less if you know where to look and how to be strategic. Because there are these essential few inputs, activities, resources, processes, investments, whatever, that lead to an outsized or disproportionate amount of outcomes. So now that we have kind of the background of this, let's talk about how you can start applying this. And this is often called Pareto analysis, but it shows up mostly in more of what we think of like business, or there's Excel functions you can do it in. And I'll share that there is a business application, but I want to get into the life side. The business application I would encourage you to do is, again, there's so many YouTube videos out there that are like, hey, you're an entrepreneur and here's how to make more money. This is not necessarily that. I know that if you're watching this, there are plenty of you that are maybe school teachers, or you're a nurse, or you just work in a large company. You can still apply this by thinking about what are the 20% or so of my investments and activities or relationships at work that lead to 80% of my outcomes. And here's an interesting thing that you can do if you're not sure, is you can actually ask your manager. This is something I did back when I worked in corporate that my manager was like, he almost looked like shocked, but was like so impressed because I was like, I got promoted to supervisor, and I was like, hey, how will my performance be assessed? Like, for instance, 3 months from now, if I say X, Y, and Z happened with these metrics, we will know that I was successful. And he was kind of like, well, it's really about building a good team. And of course, all of this bullshit, because 90% of the time in management, no one really knows what's going on. But the idea is, if he would have said, hey, you will be graded on at this time I was supervising 16 people doing data entry in a large e-commerce business. It's like, if you improve the accuracy of order entry amongst your team, we'll say team engagement, team morale, and I don't know what the third one would be, improve their productivity. So they're entering more orders. That is how you be assessed. Then I would know that when I look at my calendar, the majority of my time, or the key time I should be focusing on, are things like developing the processes of the people on my team so that they can enter things more quickly and accurately, and supporting them personally so that they're engaged and enjoy the work. It's like those two things then, even if I could only work 20 hours a week, if I were to just focus on those, at the end of the quarter, there'd probably be some improvements and my manager would be like, oh, you're really good. Whereas if I would have spent hours and hours and hours trying to, I don't know, build some new Excel model to keep track of the orders, like it might have worked really well and been super awesome, but that's not what mattered. That was not the essential inputs for my performance. So whether, again, you're a teacher, healthcare worker, a lawyer, whatever you might be, student even, right? You might think, well, what percentage of my grade is accounted for in these various activities? And if you have all these stupid little quizzes that account for 10% of your grade, you might ignore those so that you can spend more time on the big paper that accounts for 50% of your grade. This pattern's everywhere. So that's the productivity application. But as I said, this video is about happiness and life application. And that's where I think this principle can be surprisingly powerful, is that you can start to think about what are the 20%, and again, it's not exactly 20, but it's that smaller core essential few activities that I do that generate 80% of my happiness. And here's one way I sometimes give this when I'm teaching it, is I say, hey, if you could take a half day of paid time off, just go on vacation, I'll pay for it. Would you rather do it Tuesday morning from 8 to noon or Friday afternoon from noon to 4, or from 1 to 5? You're like, of course, Friday afternoon. Well, why is that? Because not all time is created equal. At that Friday afternoon, there's way more stuff going on. People are doing stuff. You can be social. And so it's just the idea that not all time and activities are created equal. And so here's how you can do this 80-20 application for your life. I suggest doing it with some pen and paper. But it's really just this. I would say if you only had maybe 5 hours, 10 hours of free time this week, how would you spend your time? What would you want to be doing? Who would you want to be spending it with? And how would that be? And just try to think, what are these critical few things that kind of lead to the majority of my happiness? And you can think about this on like a weekly or monthly cadence, and also a day-by-day one. So it's two different things. So if I think about this, I think about in a given week, probably making sure I get a couple hours of cardio and a few good lifts. Like if I don't work out, I get super weird and neurotic, even more than usual. So that would probably be on there for me. A couple good hangouts with like some of my guy friends, that's a pretty big one. And then usually I feel a lot better if I am also doing some sort of like creative work. So just some sort of learning, because I like to have some inputs coming in, not just making videos and writing articles. So I might think, okay, that's really right there is like, maybe that's 10 hours. But it's like, I know that most of my happiness comes from making sure I do the work that's fun, which for me is like learning about happiness and being a nerd, making sure I get some exercise, and having a couple nights at least where I'm just hanging out with the guys. So it's like, okay, I know that small amount of inputs leads to the majority of my happiness. So it's like, how can I do more of that? Similarly, you may think about times in your life where you've had kind of disproportionately high levels of happiness, and then bring that forward to right now. So that's another prompt, is if you think about all of the happiness you've ever had in your life, hopefully that's a decent amount of happiness. Are there any like outsized, like outlier time periods where a lot of that came from? Like for me, and don't get me wrong here, this is not to say you're not normally happy or that you've had like a shitty life and then like 2 really good bright spots. No, I mean, most of my life, I'm like, I was happy. But I definitely know like the end of senior year of high school, the end of senior year of college, like probably even the spring of last year, there were certain things that really felt like those were like a little oasis of like, that was a really good 2 or 3 months. And so I think back to what went into that. Well, senior year of college, we'll say, I was doing a lot of the really fun, like learning and teaching stuff that I like. I kind of like stepped back and didn't work as intensely and had a little better like sense of pace and sort of was like, I'm going to try to just not be too busy. And I feel like that slowed me down and it was good. And I was working out really hard and I love that. So, okay, I can start to bring that forward to now and think, oh, it's interesting how that matches up with the little weekly analysis I did, that making sure I get time for some hard workouts, making sure I don't overdo it with the work stuff, and I'm doing like some of that fun and creative learning, and boom, there you have it. So just that little exercise, starting to say, what are some of the inputs? And the same thing, I can do this with friends. Like I can think about, like, I know when I go to see someone like my buddy Luke or talk to Lewis or talk to Zach, I feel really good. So there are all these different applications, but the core theme is this. It's not just about productivity and work or whatever. Is trying to think, like, what are all of the various sources of happiness in my life? People, places, things, activities, ways to spend my time. Getting all those out and trying to identify, like, if I could just pick 3 or 4 or 5 of these, what would they be? Same thing, thinking about times of your life past. What are the 3 or 4 or 5 like really times where I was just like loving it and I was feeling so good? Okay, so what are the common principles? And then you have those two side by sides, and then you can start to, again, reorient how you're spending your time right now to focus on the 20%. Again, it won't be exact, but this idea of the small number of inputs, people, activities, things that bring you outsized or disproportionate levels of happiness and joy, you can prioritize getting those into your life right now. So again, this video is not to say like you have to be depressed or you're not happy now, or it's like you can't just be happy consistently. But like I said, this pattern exists everywhere. It exists in biology, it exists in physics, in economics, in business, everything. So I think that if you go through this exercise I suggested, especially with a pen and paper, it will be certainly a fairly profound exercise that shifts who you prioritize in your life, what you prioritize in your life, and maybe even how you prioritize in your life. Sort of like, how are you living? What is your pace? What is your focus? What is your way of being, etc. So here's a video that YouTube suggests you'll like. As always, you can find resources from the art and science of happiness here on this channel, helping you to be at your best in work and life. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.